everybody! It's your boy Ash here, and just recently I finished watching the amazing Hunter x Hunter 2011 anime, and like, oh my god, it's so good, guys, seriously. If you somehow haven't watched it yet, because I was very late to the party for sure, if you haven't watched it yet and you somehow landed on this video, do yourself a favor and watch all the 140 something episodes it has. It's totally worth it. It took me a few years actually to watch it because I'm a very slow consumer of media in general. It just kind of roll like that, and it took me, I started around early 2020 during the beginning of the pandemic, and I kept watching it on and off throughout the months up until very recently where I finally got to the end. Came back to Brazilian Netflix, made it a little more convenient for me to just watch one episode after another, and I finally made it through, and I'm absolutely in love with the show. I just needed to talk about it with you guys. So I could make a complete dissection, let's talk about Hunter x Hunter in general video, but coming off of the latest Pokemon video I made where I analyzed the entire Pokemon Scarlet and Violet DLC, and that video ended up being, the recording for it ended up being 15 minutes long, and then I chopped it down to around 35 minutes, and it was still way too long, and I kept jumping around between different topics regarding the DLC, and I realized this isn't a very sustainable method for making these kinds of videos. Kind of makes them a little bit too long, a little bit too hard to produce. So I thought that at least for this time, I should, instead of making an entire complete analysis of the show with all my thoughts and all my ideas, including, you know, stuff like all the deep philosophical themes of the Chimera Ant arc, the show's action scenes, the entire vibes the show jumps between, I would just like home in on a particular thing that I noticed that really intrigued me about it, that really made it a very unique and special experience compared to other shonen anime of its kind. And also there's just the fact that, seeing as this is a video surrounding a TV show, it's just generally much harder to get interesting footage to put on screen while I'm talking about it than it is for games where I can just sort of put gameplay on the background. But anyway, getting into the topic itself, I still haven't read the manga. I know the story continues on from that for a little bit. I know it's constantly on hiatus because of the Togashi's, the author, personal health issues, and that's a whole complicated thing I do not wish to get into this time. But I've seen some snippets of it. I do intend on getting into it eventually. I'm just taking a little break after finishing the anime. And while talking to my friends about it and looking up some stuff out of interest, trying to avoid spoilers of course, but just seeing some things here and there about the manga, it really looks like Gon, at least so far, he just isn't around in the manga for all that we've received after the point the anime ends. He's mentioned in like a few panels, and Killua just isn't there at all, and Kurapika becomes the main character for a while. And at first this really intrigued me. I was surprised because at first I was like, oh wow, really? You're really going on that direction? You really abandoned Gon after he achieved his goal of meeting his dad? But then I realized something. The show kind of always has been a little bit like this. That's what I want to get to for this video. Starting with the main cast, really. This is a perfect example. That is, usually people like to put Gon and Killua alongside Leorio and Kurapika as sort of like the main four of Hunter x Hunter. But if you really think about it, they haven't really worked together ever since the York New City arc, and that's like the first half of the series still. And really, they haven't really been like a group itself, a consistent main group for an entire arc ever since the very first arc, the Hunter exam arc. And the show has so far sort of just followed Gon and Killua around as they meet different people and go to different places, and like you can say, like in, for example, in Reed Island, the main cast is Gon, Killua, and Bisky, and like in the Chimera Ant, it starts off with Gon, Killua, and then Kite's crew, but then partway through that switches into being Gon, Killua, Knuckle, Shoot, and their respective masters, and it just sort of like keeps jumping around. There's no consistency to it. Even in stuff like York New City, even though Gon and Killua are present and are a constant like moving force in the story, since they are there for a reason, they're doing stuff, and that eventually leads into Great Island. The main focus of that arc for most of it is actually Kurapika. He's arguably the actual protagonist of that part of the show. And like, even in the very last arc, so Chairman Election arc is supposed to be sort of like the end of Gon's story, seeing as it is the end of the anime, and again, as I mentioned, going forward after the point of the anime ends, Gon isn't really the protagonist anymore. But Gon is basically dead for most of it. He's, bedridden, healing from the stuff that happened back in Chimera Age, and Killua is doing most of the stuff as far as figuring out how to heal Gon goes during most of that arc. And speaking of Killua, there's also the fact that even though he kind of shares the main character role with Gon through most of the anime, he doesn't show up until a few episodes after Kurapika and Leorio are first introduced alongside Gon in the first episode. For just a few episodes in the very first arc, it's just Gon, Kurapika, and Leorio, and Killua comes up a little later. Just so happens that then it becomes Gon and Killua, and then that switches around again a few times, and that's kind of how this show rolls. And this even extends beyond the main cast. The tone and themes of the show are ever changing. Every arc feels substantially different from each other, really. You go from Gon and Killua chilling out in Whale Island and figuring out a few things about Greed Island in one episode, and then in the very next it becomes this very serious urban crime drama about Kurapika trying to get revenge on the Phantom Troop. And then you got fun little SAO but better in Greed Island. And then you go from that to Chimera Ant, which is basically Togashi just saying fuck it and making it almost as long as half the anime, and making it extremely deep and philosophically interesting in a way the show wasn't as much before. Even though it was still interesting, like, yeah, Chimera Ant goes insanely hard on that whole deal. And, this format is cool, but it does lead to a few anti-climaxes, if I'm allowed to, criticize it, because I think this is awesome. I think this idea is awesome. I'm gonna get into it in a little bit, but one thing that does kind of damage the show in regards to that is the fact that it's more common to get an anti-climax than an actual full-on, like, hype moment in the show. Everything comes with a little bit of sort of a monkey's paw situation. Things aren't always resolved by the good guy punching the bad guy hard enough they explode or something, or they, get spared or something, back for forgiveness. Characters go out and come in, and villains die or don't die, or they escape, and then they come back just like a few hundred episodes later, suddenly this character's back. The lack of structure, while interesting and good, it kind of leads to a little bit of a scattered around format where you can't really have the usual battle shonen climaxes we're used to. So like, for example, in Dragon Ball Z, we got the Namek arc. And in that, we have a very clear progression of where the arc starts, slowly rising stakes and intensity as the arc goes on, which leads into, the Super Saiyan stuff, and the Namek about to blow up stuff, and whatnot. And Hunter x Hunter doesn't really have that because it isn't trying to do that. What we miss out on is stuff like Goku achieving Super Saiyan, which is like, this amazing, iconic sort of moment in all of anime, and Hunter x Hunter doesn't really try to do that. It's going for the exact opposite of that. People like to say Hunter x Hunter is a deconstruction of battle shonen for, breaking its tropes like this and basically, subverting a lot of the stuff you expect from shonen, especially what I just talked about with the whole anti-climax stuff. But, well, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily disagree. It's a deconstruction. It's not a very blatant one. If you compare it to something like, let's say, Madoka Magica, for example, which is another anime that tries to deconstruct a very popular genre, in that, there's a very clear point in the story where it goes, boom, things are messed up now, haha, tricked you, this is a deconstruction, and it goes through basically every necessary step to make sure it's like, almost, in a ton of ways, the complete opposite of what a magical girl story usually is. Meanwhile, Hunter x Hunter is way more subtle with its sort of like divergences from the shonen formula. It still has a lot of shonen tropes. It's still very much focused on battles and, and has a lot of themes about self-improvement, and the characters train, and they have, exaggeratedly elaborate power sets and energy beams and strong punches that shatter the earth and stuff. And on top of that, all this typical shonen stuff isn't played as some kind of weird facade, nor is it just brushed away once the darker stuff comes in. The good feeling positive moments come and go across the story, and remain just as sincere and endearing as all the messed up dark things it tackles, if not more so. It's not trying to be a complete middle finger to shonen anime. Honestly, I would sort of say it reads more like Togashi just wants to do whatever the hell he wants. And that's kind of awesome, if you ask me, because that leads to a sort of realism in Hunter x Hunter's writing. Because it's so stream of consciousness, right? Because it doesn't stick to a particular sort of structure or format that's previously established by this kind of show, or itself in general. The characters in this show are just people. They come and go. They don't have to stick around with each other all the time. The show isn't called Gon and Killua, it's called Hunter x Hunter. It can focus on whatever the heck it wants around this world that Togashi created with these characters that are so distinct and unique and play very different roles. A less subtle deconstruction or breaking of shonen conventions would just make Gon a villain during the Chimera Ant arc, where, everyone talks about how he basically breaks down and does a lot of morally questionable stuff. But still, ultimately, right after that, after Gon heals from that and everything is resolved, he's still the same cheery kid. We understand him a little better. He does have a little bit more of a complex psychology compared to other protagonists of his kind, but he doesn't suddenly do a heel turn and it's suddenly bad, or the show doesn't directly call out shonen tropes or try to do something completely wholeheartedly different. It just makes things a little more natural. It just tries to ask, okay, but what if? What if Gon just isn't this perfect being? It doesn't mean that he isn't a good boy, it just means that he makes some very clear big mistakes. And there's not going to be an answer as to, was he right, was he wrong? No, it just sort of is. In a lot of ways, this show just sort of is. It does whatever it wants, and it's so interesting and unique because of that. That's a quality that almost no other show of its kind has. Who even is the villain in Hunter x Hunter, right? Because we have the Phantom Troop, they become prominent around York New City, and then they show up in a few different parts of the story after that, and well, yeah, I guess they're the most consistent villainous force, seeing as they are mentioned before that, even in the first arc. We got Hisoka before that, who was kind of in, going through his whole deal of trying to find strong opponents, morality be damned, and he's the major villainous force in the first arc, but then he comes back, but he's not always necessarily working as the major villainous force. He even works alongside Gon and Killua during Greed Island, and he's sort of buddy-buddy with Killua's brother, and Killua's family in general is kind of messed up too, and they're kind of villains. But even the Phantom Troop, they fight the Chimera Ants during the Chimera Ant arc because they are following their personal goals of protecting their city. And I don't think I even have to say anything about the Chimera Ants themselves. You know how morally ambiguous they all are. So, in this sense, this show doesn't really have a villain or even a series of villains by each arc. It's ever-changing, it's constant. The characters do whatever they feel like because of their own interests and their own ideals and their own just sort of personalities and whatever the hell goes on in their minds. It's not simply bad guy, good guy. It's people. A lot of messed up, questionable people. There are good people, there are bad people. There's pretty much everything in between. And as a lot of people like to point out, most hunters are kind of selfish assholes, and that's the whole point the show kind of makes by itself. But even then we have people like Leorio and arguably Gon and Killua by the end of the anime, who aren't really bad or perfect little beings. They're people. And that's so interesting, how it can go between all of these different ideas. But it turns out there's a reason for all of that. As most of you probably already know, Hunter x Hunter is basically the spiritual successor to one of Togashi's previous works, that is Yu Yu Hakusho, which I haven't yet experienced myself, but I'm looking forward to doing so eventually. And from what I've researched and understand, that show, while it's great, it kind of suffered from a bit of a rushed ending because Togashi was already experiencing those health issues from overworking too much, and he was noticeably facing a lot of restrictions as far as what he could and could not write in his story, and he was feeling a little bit limited by that. So eventually he just decided to say, whatever, let's end it right now and I'll start focusing on myself. Eventually, Shueisha, the owners of Shonen Jump, the company that publishes Hunter x Hunter, they came back to Togashi and they said, okay, we want you to do one more manga for us. And then Togashi was like, nah, I don't want to do it. But then they came up with a deal where basically Togashi has way more creative freedom than he usually would in a manga for Shonen Jump. So what basically we have figured out, the fans have figured out, according to some copyright info people have found on a few of the manga releases, is that basically it seems like Togashi owns the Hunter x Hunter IP. And Shueisha is just going through the process of publishing it. They're just the publishers, they're not the IP holders. So what that means, at least in theory, is that if Togashi just wanted to talk to a different magazine and start publishing Hunter x Hunter on that instead, he is in the legal right to do it. Which means he basically can do whatever the hell he wants. As long as Shueisha is still interested in publishing the story, he's gonna keep writing and the story is his, and it doesn't have to go through the same process of, branding and deals and stuff like that that would usually go through a typical Shonen Jump manga. With that in mind, basically Hunter x Hunter is Togashi just exercising this freedom. You got to see the characters jumping around and doing all sorts of different stuff in a very stream of consciousness sort of way, because Togashi can just do it now. He doesn't have to worry about it in the same way most stories of its kind have. He can just, okay, so what kind of story do I want to write? And it goes from there. There's no structure or limits or stuff he generally can't do as far as, basic reason goes anyway. So, if the second to last episode in Gon's story contains 10 minutes of deep philosophical reflection with a sort of questionable conclusion about an arc that ended 10 episodes ago, so be it! You can do it! That's just how the story rolls. And that's something that I can very much admire. So yeah, everyone, that's the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like, and if you have anything interesting to add to the discussion, please do so in the comments. I love reading and responding to whatever you guys say in the comments. It's one of the most fun things, most fulfilling things about these videos. And if you didn't like it, give it a dislike. Let me know what you didn't like and help me in making sure these videos can keep constantly improving. So thanks for watching and see you guys next time. Bye bye!
僕らにどんな世界が道なき道の先に待ってる声なき声はこのままどこにも届かずに消えてゆくの忘れ